Hello everyone and welcome back to another Stratagoy video. Today we're doing an in-depth review of the typical SYLVANETH conundrum, swords or scythes. I asked my mathematical genius friend Ryan to chart up and graph up some statistics for you guys. So he's coming along for the ride. Ryan, thank you for all your effort and your work.
Yeah, so for those 14 or so people that have already watched this and are having deja vu right now, what ended up happening was we did a live stream. Jonas and I recorded this a couple days earlier with all the results. Then we did, during our live stream, one of our Discord buddies, Siegfried, he ended up pointing out that the numbers were quite different than StatsHammer, which I don't typically use, and it turned out I had made an Excel copy and paste error with every single calculation. The math was right, but the Excel was wrong, the functionality of it. And it was pretty easy to fix. It took me about 3.5 hours to go back and redo all 30 graphs and everything. But we're back on now. And so we have what amounts to totally different results. So if you watched the first time, then welcome back to a second viewing here that might actually change your mind once again. But if this is your first time watching, hopefully there are no more mistakes moving forward, and we can just continue to keep giving you great math and otherwise content on the channel.
Yeah. So our aim with this video is a video to end all other videos on this subject, basically. You've probably seen a lot of stats floating around the internet, but with this one, we aim to give you some insights in how we get these stats that you see floating around, and we also end with a conclusion and a comparison on when to use what kind of Kurnoth Hunter, at least between the swords and the scythes. The bows are obviously not considered in this example. If you like this kind of video, please do leave a like and a comment. It always helps the algorithm so our videos get noticed. And also join our Discord, especially now is a great time because we have a lot of other players who are delivering on their inputs and leaving a lot of interesting content in our Discord as well. So please consider that as well. Okay, Ryan, I'm going to give you the lead now and take us away.
Sure thing. So just like I did in our intro to MathHammer video, which hopefully you guys have seen, I like to look at what we actually don't need to compare between our two units here first, so we can kind of reduce it down to the important variables. So what's the same and between these two units? Obviously their tankiness. This would be their save, their wounds characteristic, and also their bravery for leadership tests, battle shock tests. Then we've got their points per output. They're currently both 250 points. Obviously the bows are different, but the bows are different in so many ways that it's not really what we're looking at here. Base size is the same at a 50 millimeter base. Obviously there are 3 models per unit that you pay for with 1 champion. They have all the same keywords, so their ability to receive buffs is the same. And this is worth pointing out, in the calculations I did not take into account trample underfoot, because they both have exactly the same ability. So it just made it a little less redundant by adding in that extra half wound per model of mortal wounds that they'll do at the end of the combat phase. So this is, for the rest of this, we're going to be assuming that that's just not being compared here, and that we're working with a full strength unit at any given moment. Obviously, if the unit gets smaller over time, some things will change, especially with the scythes/swords when reinforced issue. But for the most part, it's basically the same calculation. As far as what we need to do to consider here, so obviously the swords have their awesome 2 mortal wounds on 6s to hit, but this is compared to the pile-in penalty that the scythes get. And Siegfried's also changed my mind on this pile-in rule. As it's worded right now, if someone chooses not to pile in, even though they can pile in, then they haven't done a pile-in move, which is the wording here for the scythes, and therefore this pile-in thing isn't going to happen. So the net effect here is I have included it as their output, which means scythes are actually a little worse if they don't pile in, but it's relatively marginal because it's only 1 mortal wound regardless of how many models you have in your unit. But perhaps what that does change is the tankiness a little bit, because if they don't pile in, that enemy unit might not be able to get as many attacks in, right? But of course, if a single model moves even a little bit to make this possible, then that would count. Obviously, the rend is different between the two units at -1 for the swords and -3 for the scythes, and that has a big impact. And we're going to be going up against multiple states of saves, though I didn't take into account wards because just the matrix of regular saves crossed with ward saves gets pretty crazy and isn't necessarily something you're seeing all the time. And of course, as I mentioned before, the range of the weapons is different. Hopefully this is all pretty clear. We've got our comparison here for the base stats, and this is what we're going to be spending most of our time looking at, is this type of chart. So let's go through some of the minutia here. This is for a single unit, an MSU unit of 3 models with no buffs, of course. As far as the y-axis is concerned, we're going from 0 to 18, leaving some headroom there because one of these that we're going to end up seeing in a minute goes all the way up to almost 18. I think it goes to 17 and a third. So I wanted each one of these 3 times graphs to be comparable. That said, when we do the 1 time reinforced or 6 models, 6 times graphs, those go up to 35 on the scale. So you would have to compare one to the other. I didn't want to put these out of 35 because then it'd have way too much headroom and it'd be harder to see the differences. So the swords will always be in blue. The scythes will always be in orange. And along the x-axis there, we have increasingly stronger saves. Expected value pre, EV pre, is just my notation for the expected value that we have before taking into consideration their saves, which I've talked about in the some of the other MathHammer videos that we've done. I like to sometimes just look at this because then calculating all of the potential scales or saves can be complicated. And some people like to just look at it from a 4+ save basis. But as you can see here, it gets quite different as we get down if we have weaker saves or way better saves. Now, in this particular case, the scythes are trailing after the swords from a 4-up save on. But we'll see as things go on that a 4-up save is not necessarily the average. Depends on what your meta is, who you're up against. Finally, that expected value pre is basically a 7-up save, but functionally it could be even worse, obviously, with the rend that we've got, if that were possible.
Yeah, so just looking at their base stats, we can conclude that swords are actually always better, but especially more useful against probably flimsy hordes like Gits or zombies.
Yeah, and something I'm going to reference later that I didn't account for in the first video because of the difference in scores here. Though the swords are better, you can see that they're marginally better. That's a tiny fraction better. Also, it's important to note that the reason that they're performing as well as the scythes are at high saves is because the scythes have such good rend, but the swords have the mortal wounds that proc on 6s. That said, the mortal wounds procking on 6s is very swingy, meaning there's a lot of variance there. A lot of times you're not going to get a whole lot of it. And so the scythes are actually better if you're also taking into consideration the variance or how reliable they are. And this chart doesn't capture that. So I just want to put that out there that yes, it looks like the swords are better, and they will, on average, with an infinite number of combats, perform better than the scythes. But in any given moment in a game, though, you might want the scythes for the reliability.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, so you also made a graph for the reinforced versions. And we're going to look at this kind of comparison, so MSU versus reinforced, for both units when they get a single buff, when they get 2 kinds of buffs, and then when they get all the buffs, right?
Yeah, so this is the reinforced, but it's not entirely reinforced. So because of the way swords work, you can get all 6 of them into combat if you position them just right. Of course, once you lose a model, they're at coherency 5, and then of 5 models, and then they can all get in. But let's assume 6 for right now. What I did in these comparisons is I assumed we would take scythes in one big unit of 6, but that because of that range issue, we would take swords in 2 units of 3, so at MSU. And I also assumed that meant when they got up their first buff, only one of those 2 units would get it. Now, sometimes that's less true than others, but to make this like, kind of holding all things equal for kind of experiment purposes, that's what we're doing. So what we have here is going to be 2 MSU units of swords versus 1 reinforced unit of scythes. As you can see, The scale is also different, which means the difference between the two lines is more significant whenever we're looking at the 6 times charts, because any gap is going to be covering more range on that 0 to 35. So you got to take that with a grain of salt a little bit. But as you can see here, when we reinforce, even though the swords are just doubling and not getting the buff on both units, there is no buff in this case. They're just doubling in this case. What we're really seeing here is the difference that they get from having an extra champion, plus they were already better to begin with. And you can see that from 4 on, the lines are parallel, that just like they were before. They maintain their lead over the Scythes proportionally as saves get better. Yeah. Is that clear?
Yeah, and when we were thinking about giving out buffs, because that's why we included this specific graph, it is obviously going to be important to note the difference that we're in this comparison. We're always thinking about 2 times 3 swords and 1 times 6 sides. So the sides are always going to get the full buff, while the swords only get the buff on one of their 2 units, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's look at some single buff graphs, and we'll go through these at a much higher pace because we don't want to make this video too long.
Sure. So our 6 buffs that you can get consistently in Sylvaneth without bringing in too much extra stuff is going to be +1 to hit, +1 to wound, +1 attack, +1 damage, extra rend, and exploding hits. And we're going to look at them in that order. So here we've got +1 to hit, which you can get either by choosing specific targets in Heartwood, 3 different units, or of course using all-out attack, which is one of the reasons why we've done this whole 1 unit of swords gets it, but the other unit doesn't, because of how command abilities work. Here we're seeing that the swords ended up raising their lead a little bit, what it appears to be, in the worse saves area, as the Scythes are a little bit more flatlined. But now you can see that the Scythes are in fact better, but again, marginally so from 4 up on. Jonas, would you say that's enough for you to want to take Scythes at this point?
Personally, no, because I like the flexibility of having 2 times 3 units. Though, you know, there is something to say, and we'll mention that in our conclusion slide, but there is something to say for a big unit of 6, because you can strike and fade them much easier. I mean, at least you can strike and fade them fully. That's what I mean. For me, no, I like the swords more still, because the difference is so minor here. But there are certain situations where I would definitely run Scythes, yeah.
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that for any kind of resurrection ability, so the spell that you've got, I forget exactly what it's called, but that brings Verdurous Harmony or something like that.
Yeah.
And also the Seekers and also Rally. Having a bigger unit really is better, because you have more opportunity to get that off before the whole unit's wiped out. As soon as the whole unit's wiped out, all those options are gone because the unit's not on the field anymore.
Yeah.
So, and also if you have a unit of 6 and you get all the way down to 1, you get to roll 5 dice for that rally, and that could be huge. Yeah. So I always think that a big unit has plenty of perks, especially when we're trying to keep our drops low as well. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, but it has some downsides as well, but we'll discuss that in the last slide. Mm-hmm. Okay, so reinforced, it looks somewhat the same.
It's identical. It's just shifted up with how much output we're getting. So that Kurnoth, the sword Kurnoths are getting just under 30 wounds output at their max here. And then it's, you know, basically the same. I think they took over the lead a little bit.
I was just going to say it's not completely identical, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's functionally very similar. If you split the 2 sides, it probably would go back to exactly what it was before. Yeah. So
okay. Right. +1 to wound from the Arch Revenant.
Yes, or Scythes Wild Hunt spell.
True.
Or of course Inspired the Triumph.
Yep.
So here we can see that the Scythes get more of a lead in from 4 up on. Why do you think that is?
Well, the rent is so high that you effectively don't have a save, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean from the flat line there. I mean from 4 up on, so to the right. Why are they a little bit higher marginally than they were with +1 to hit?
Their rent has way more impact now compared to the only -1 range from the swords.
That's true. What the swords are really doing most of their work with, though, is that proccing.
Mm-hmm. The mortal wounds.
And the +1 to wound or +1 to hit means that more stuff gets to go through in addition to the proccing. Whereas the +1 to wound, some of your attacks have been removed because of the proccing. So if you get one of the off, now you have one less attack to have to roll for, and the wound doesn't help you anymore.
Yeah.
If that makes
yeah. So the swords basically skip the to wound phase, and the +1 to wound helps the sides while it doesn't affect the swords as much, since they sometimes skip the to wound phase anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So when we reinforce on our next slide, it narrows the gap there. Generally speaking, reinforcing helps the swords better. That's the story that we're going to be telling throughout these slides. Is that doing 2 units of three swords is generally better than 1 unit of fully buffed scythes, and that's what we're seeing once again.
Yeah.
All right. +1 attack. This is only coming from the Archrev, and since it's a command ability, you can only give it to 1. So this makes a bit of a difference, but +1 attack, you might say this looks very similar to the last slide, where the swords are still basically outperforming the scythes, in contrast to the +1 to wound that were +1 to hit that we saw earlier. The difference here is that +1 attack gives you that much more of a chance to proc those 6s, and that goes a lot further than it does with the scythes in this case. And if we double it, let's look at the double. The reinforced version of this slide. And now, it looks like the scythes around a 4-up save got a little bit more of a lead, but around a 1-up save, it looks like it kind of swung a bit more towards the swords. So at the end of the day, this is all kind of this marginal difference. And I would still say what you're choosing from a 4-up save or higher is whether you want a big unit and whether you want more stability in knowing your stuff's going to go through without having to spike.
Yep.
All right, look at the next one. +1 damage. Now this is conditional. You have to choose bounty hunters, which of course raises your drops, and it has to be against Galician veterans, which not as many people are taking. But spoiler warning, this is generally speaking the best buff that we've got here. You can see that for swords, it just after they level off there, it kind of just descends at a rapid rate, and the scythes end up starting to take a bit of a lead there. I think the scythes, this is one of the ones they like the best. It creates one of the bigger leads over the swords because, again, the swords proccing doesn't benefit from the bounty hunter's +1 damage. It's always 2 mortal wounds, no matter whether you got bounty hunter on or right.
Yep.
Yeah. So with the scythes, they're getting 3 with everything that goes through, whereas the with bounty hunters, the swords are only getting 2 on the mortal wounds and 3 with the rest that remains. All right, let's look at 6. Okay, so it looks like there's a little bit more of a lead here for the scythes, but again, this is just more for comparison's sake. We're not going to go into detail about every one of these slides. This is just if you want to take a look at them later and compare them for future reference. All right, let's move on.
What's fascinating to me about the +1 damage buff is that you'll usually don't take it on scythes because the bounty hunters don't really... I mean, you don't want to push in your scythes with -3 rends on the usual Galician veterans, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. But the counterpoint to that I'll mention later, but might as well mention it here too, is that you can only put 3 units in bounty hunters, and if you're taking MSU of swords, that means unless you double them up, you're only getting 9 Kurnoths in the unit, whereas you could get maximum 18 in bounty hunters for the scythe. So there are pluses and minuses there, but I get what you mean. That rend is not going to help unless the Galician veteran is super tanky or something.
Yeah, and if you're running 18 scythes, that's 75% of your army. So
Sure.
Good luck winning a game.
Well, now you're challenging me. It sounds like a running list.
Let's look at the improved rend.
Okay, so what's your intuition here?
Well,
what's going on here?
You can see that the scythes stay the same for longer because effectively their huge rend that they already have, when it's improved by Tree Song or even Purple Sun at this time, it's basically the same as having a mortal wound, right? You don't get any save anyway.
Yeah, so if you compared this to the base profile that we saw, I think it's exactly the same thing because Tree Song doesn't make you it doesn't make your max output more, like double damage or +1 attack does, or adding a damage. This is just making you more reliable. So the Scythes stay more reliable for longer, and then as we see here, just like with the base profile, the swords end up being on top for even longer. At 4+, they've got quite a gap, and now at 3+, they just are barely ahead.
Yep.
So that's what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's check the next one. So the swords get even more of a little lead here because, again, Tree Song doesn't help the Scythes as much. Yeah, -4 rend. The original video, I was a little bit condescending towards people that are excited about -4 rend, and you called me out on it. So let's be less condescending. But as you can see here, -4 rend helps, but it's got a limit to what it's going to ultimately do.
Yeah, it's super cool though to me that if you're running Scythes or swords even, and you're pushing them into a unit of 3+ save, which is practically the standard now, they're still going to dish out around 17 damage for 500 points. So that's quite good.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Exploding hits is our last one. Now, Jonas, you might notice I've added something here.
Yes, I love the addition here. That's great.
Yeah. After I had to redo everything, I said, screw it, I wanted to do this from the beginning anyway, so let me figure out how to put it in there. So we still have our buffed swords in blue and our buffed Scythes in orange, but in the gray line here is what swords would be base. Now, why did I add this? What's going on here?
Well, the gray line is the swords using the 6 to hit as a ways to deal mortal wounds, while the blue line is the swords using the exploding hits from Everdusk.
Right, and because you can't have both, you have to choose one or the other.
Yep.
So as we see here, let's just look at the swords. So the blue versus the gray. The exploding hits are in fact better from no save to a 5+ save, although increasingly marginally so.
Yeah.
And then they're actually worse. Your guy's getting worse from a 4+ down to a 1+. Now remember, you can choose. If you're in Everdusk, you can still choose to be proccing mortal wounds instead of the +1s. The exploding hits. But maybe that feels like a waste of Everdusk, especially considering how much better the Scythes are here. If you compare Scythes with Everdusk versus swords with Everdusk, it's the biggest lead Scythes has of all the ones we've looked at here. That keeps getting better. And if you compare Scythes with Everdusk versus swords with their base profile, so they didn't get the buff here, Scythes are outperforming them from a 5+ save on, which is good.
Yeah, the something to note though, and we'll mention this for sure in the double buff section, but if you combine this buff with the +1 damage buff from Bounty Hunters, it might actually push the swords buff over the swords base, or it probably will at least.
Yeah, in general, that multiplier, like anytime we start adding multipliers, we just didn't. I actually did graphs for all of those, but I didn't include them in this because it was a lot of stuff.
Okay, let's look at the reinforced version.
So the gap tightens there, right? Because reinforcing benefits the swords. So Scythes are less on top, and the difference between swords buff versus swords not buff. Now, remember the scale is different. So it could just be a visual. It might effectively be the same thing. I didn't put percentages in here, but you can see that the graph does get a little tighter when it comes to Scythes and swords.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
All right. So walk me through this one. What are you getting from this guy? What's going on here?
Well, I studied these when you sent the new ones over to me, because these kind of slides are the most important ones to me. You should basically print this when you're going to a tournament. Just to check what you need to use versus what kind of saves. To me personally, I get from this that, considering that a 3+ save is somewhat the average for most armies, at least with all-out events being a thing, using the Bounty Hunters is great if you can get that, but the +1 attack from the Arch Revenant is super impactful, and the +1 to wound is also nice. So considering that both of those buffs come from the same model, what I get from these slides specifically is bring a fucking Arch Revenant.
Yeah, you always should. And remember that +1 to wound bubble is just a bubble, so it can go on anyone that's around him. or her. Yeah, and so the only place where the best performance switches is kind of against a 2-up save there. Or a 3-up save, it looks like that's where the +1 damage ends up flipping with +1 attack. And then at the very end, Tree Song's improved rend takes over just slightly. Now, what the other thing I find interesting about this chart is the base profile is the dark blue line, or no, the light blue line. And you can see the dark blue line, which is exploding hits. It's another way of visualizing what we just talked about, that the exploding hits make them way worse compared to the base as you progress to worse and worse or stronger saves. So
yeah, maybe the last thing to note here is that from 3+ save on, especially for the 3+ save and the 4+ save, it's important to note that the difference between the buffs is very marginal. If you look at those buffs, they are so close together. So even though you can obviously maximize your output this way, you don't have to keep worrying about getting the exact right buff on them, because the bonus is always way higher than not taking a buff, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's look at the sides.
All right, so as I mentioned in the original video, this seems to have fewer lines, but the reason is that +1 to hit or wound and exploding hits all have the exact same impact on a unit like Scythes. Now, that's not always true. Like if something's generating mortal wounds on like proccing and then it's not in addition, like we saw with the swords, then we have much more divergent lines. But here, 3 of our lines got lumped into that dark blue line. So they're pick and choose. Obviously, you could use them in combo to get even better. But as we see here, the clear winner with no crossover whatsoever is Bounty Hunters at +1 damage, followed by +1 attack, which only gets surpassed by improved rend against a 1-up save. And then, the rest of it's kind of just below that. It's relatively marginal, ultimately, once again. But if you want the most impact with either swords, you're going to go with +1 damage.
Yeah.
For Scythes.
For Scythes, yeah, exactly. It's also interesting to note here that the 2 best buffs are the same for swords and Scythes.
Yeah, I mean that's true just across the game in general. When we start talking about D6 stuff in my future Math Hammer videos, you're going to see that to get more multiplier, you're going to get way more out of adjusting the front end of the equation or the back end. Adjusting the middle, especially now that we're limited on only being able to make it +1 or ±1 net, doesn't actually end up having nearly as much impact. Okay. Especially if you're an elite unit. If you're kind of a shitty unit, then it does have a big impact.
That's super interesting. I'm looking forward to that video. So stay tuned, guys, for that, and subscribe if you want to stay in touch for that. Okay, moving on to double buffs, because single buffs are obviously an easy thing to make happen, but double buffs are also not that hard to enable for your troops, right?
Right, and I could have looked at all the buffs in any permutation, but I didn't want to go too crazy on that. So the way this chart works here is what I did is I looked at all 15 possible combinations of the 6 different buffs that we've discussed. There's 15 of them, and I computed their expected value against all the saves, and then took the top 3 of each save. So that's 21 times something could have possibly landed in the top 3. And then calculated how many times that keyword or that buff popped up. So for example, the top 3s is basically what we're looking at. Bounty Hunters appeared 18 out of 21 possible slots, meaning Bounty Hunters was very much a crucial choice for boosting your guys' output. And the most recurring bottom 3, so the worst one, is Everdusk. Why is Everdusk so bad in combo with swords? We've already said it. It's because it replaces the proccing mortal wounds. So it's very clear why that's there. And then you can see what else is there. Obviously, we said before that Bounty Hunters and +1 attack are generally the 2 best, but there's quite a big swing there. Bounty Hunters appears 18 times in the combos, but are in the top 3 combos. But the +1 attack is less than half of that. So that's why I included the numbers this time, which I didn't have last time. Same thing with on the bottom 3. Tree Song's only about half as bad as Everdusk is for the swords when we're talking about how well they contribute to buff combos of 2. So just looking through the list that I have here of bullet points, improved damage is easily the best, but situational and harder to max at MSU. I kind of referenced this earlier because how many units you can squeeze into that battalion, since you can only take 1 copy of the battalion. Exploding hits are generally the worst, but with +1 damage in particular, they're actually strong. But that's the only case where they're strong. So that's interesting. Improved rend or +1 to hit are good when needed, but bad otherwise. This is basically another way of saying they appear in both the top 3 and the bottom 3. So like, sometimes they're particularly good against good saves, but against everything else, they're totally worthless. Relatively speaking, compared to other things you could choose, and vice versa. You could be seeing that kind of thing. So for example, Tree Song, improved rend, is worthless against light saves. It's one of the worst buffs you can give because it literally doesn't do it doesn't add anything to your output or your consistency. And lastly, +1 to wound is the least helpful buff due to mortal wounds on hits. Like we said before, after you've gotten your mortal wounds through, making the +1 to wound just doesn't have that much of an impact on the Kurnoths with swords. So that's kind of a summary of what's going on here. I could have done top 5, bottom 5, but I thought top 3 was reasonable enough. And I don't think it would swing the results all that much if I included 2 more slots.
Yep. Okay, and then for the Scythes?
Yeah, it changes a little bit more than it did last time. Bounty Hunters does stay on top, and what did I say this is out of? 21. Bounty Hunters literally popped up in every single one of the against every single save value and every single top combo. It appeared in the top 3 every single time. So that's saying something. Whereas Tree Song only appeared as the worst one in 16 of them, but it's still not that great. Otherwise, we're seeing +1 to hit and +1 attack are equally valuable, and +1 to hit and Everdusk are equally unvaluable in this sense. Again, +1 to hit appears in both of those. Everdusk actually appears in both too, although it's ranked 3rd here. And then +1 to wound. Oh, I left out how many times it popped up. Just for funsies, +1 to wound popped up. I've got it right here, 6 times. So it's definitely diminishing. Anyway, I was rushing to get these slides out. So our bullet points, we got +1 damage is once again the best by far. And unlike these swords, it's easier to max out with Scythes 2-inch range with bigger units. Improved rend is clearly the loser. And it's even middling at extreme saves, which is interesting because our initial results did not suggest this. But improved rend is just not that great, even against a 1-up save. It's kind of in the middle of the pack as one of your buff options. They really just don't need it. Like I said, putting it to a 4-up save doesn't really do that much. Okay, +1 to hit and exploding hits are good when needed, but bad otherwise. Same as with the swords, but now it's different things. Also, exploding hits, though they help the most in this swords comparison with the Scythes, is actually the least helpful buff. What do I mean by that? Exploding hits, as we saw in the chart, when compared with swords was exploding hits, had the biggest improvement for Scythes. It was the only time when Scythes really outshone the swords. Yep. But despite that, when you use it in double buffs, it doesn't contribute very much. So to their actual output.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. There. So Everdusk not really coming out of this well.
Yeah, and I've been, if you remember back to our list, our Sylvaneth Battletome review, I wasn't big on Everdusk to begin with because it reduces your bubbles. That said, we're not looking at all the units in the right. Maybe some units really like those exploding 6s.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Then for funsies, as we would say, you put in a graph when you get all 6 buffs off at the same time.
Right. Notably, this has to be in Heartwood because you can't do all-out attack and +1 attack at the same time. Yeah. So, we're seeing that we max out at 40 wounds for a unit of 3, and so you can more or less double that if we did 6 times, which is pretty insane. But of course, that's against a 5-up save or worse. They look like they cross over almost exactly at a 4-up save where Scythes take the lead. So here's an example where Scythes have a good bit of lead here. The other thing to point out is, unlike the last calculations I did, my little subtitle here was that Everdust swords were better than Mortal Wounds on all but like a 3-up, I think, or 2-up and 1-up.
Yeah.
And now it's actually, with the new numbers, it's actually even better.
That's
which is funny. If you're using all 6 buffs, you should actually use the exploding 6s on the swords, which is weird, but it is how the math works out. So, yeah. But, I mean, if someone actually gets all 6 of these buffs off, I would love to hear about it. I want a battle report. I want to hear about how you also simultaneously hand-dusted Nagash off with his own spell somehow. I want to hear about all the crazy shit. So if I put this roughly on the same level as that, you'll probably never get this off, but it would be cool anyway.
Yeah, okay. Definitely. Definitely let us know, guys. So when we're considering what kind of units we're taking, or what kind of units we're putting in our army, there are some points that you have to consider. Ryan, you put in the first one?
Yeah, so per model versus per unit doesn't scale. This is just a simple way of saying that if we do the math per model, though the Kurnoth swords end up this scales pretty well, despite the champion has an extra attack. Because of the pile-in situation with the Scythes, which doesn't matter how big the unit is, it gets less and less impressive the bigger the unit is. So, for example, if for some reason you had 3 units of Scythes and they all got knocked down to 1 model, say the champion, all 3 of them, this is the very best version of that pile-in move they're ever going to get, that pile-in penalty, because all 3 of them trigger it if they're in combat. But if you took exactly 1 unit of 3, you're only getting it once, and so that's kind of something to keep in mind here. Every single one of the calculations I did was per unit, not per model. A lot of times I like to do per model because I think that's an easier comparison sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You also have to consider what else is in your army. Not only what other units that fulfill the same role. For example, if you're running Spite Rider Lances, they somewhat kill the same kind of unit as sword hunters would do, for example. But also, remember, if you're running 2x3 swords compared to 1x6 Scythes hunters, those swords give you way more versatility in board presence, while the 6 Scythes are just like a death star that your opponent can try to avoid. So definitely consider what else is in your army.
Yeah, and these guys cost a lot, so so we talked about reinforcing this 6 times. What the general kind of summary is here. In short, at their base profile or max 1 buff, swords improve more than Scythes do, despite only 1 unit receiving that buff. And this is due to the +1 attack for the champion, which is making the swords better. And then the Scythes pile-in gets worse, as I just mentioned. So that's kind of partly where that's coming from. In short, Scythes are only better from 4+ to 3+ against those saves for the +1 to wound or +1 attack buffs, and from 4+ to 1+ save with a +1 damage or Everdust. In short, that's out of 7 different states. Remember, we had the base plus 6 different buffs. 4 of them, they are better, but I will point out that for the most part, they are marginally better, except for Everdusk and sometimes the other ones at specific moments. But in general, reinforcing the way we did it is just the swords come out on top. But again, Scythes have the consistency thing, which has not been taken into account here. So if you don't like variance, give the Scythes a little bit more of a look than we've otherwise been talking.
Yeah.
All right.
And then to conclude.
Yeah, we cut out a whole slide here because it was too much in the weeds. And so I just did summaries here. Especially considering you basically should take swords. We used to say, take swords win and take Scythes win, but it's basically just take swords unless everything else we're about to mention. So the swords outperform the Scythes in general. 2x3 is even better versus 1x6 Scythes, so that's cool. The obvious weaknesses to keep in mind, though, are reinforcing until you get down to 5 models, that Everdusk is mostly being wasted. There's a slight disadvantage as bounty hunters, and they're notably swingier than Scythes, as I said. But I really do think, as the internet's been saying too, that swords come out way more on top here, apart from the swinginess. The Scythes, though, are generally worse than swords, but again, they're much more consistent. They can, but emphasis on can, and only marginally sometimes, outperform versus better saves, 4-up to 1-up, which you mentioned a good bit last time, that is kind of the meta we're in right now.
Yeah, but that's only the case when they have bounty hunters and Everdusk on. So in general, how often are you using your 500-point unit to kill a Galician veteran with bounty hunters, right?
It wasn't just then. With +1 attacks, it was only better on a 4-up. With +1, +1 to hit was marginally better from 4 to 1. +1 to wound was same thing.
Yeah.
You might be thinking the double buffs. The double buffs are reinforcing. Mm-hmm. But yeah. And then let's see. Their best performance is with 2 or more buffs. They really like to get those double buffs, not the reinforced. Slightly more defensive due to the pile-in move, which the pile-in mortal wounds, which means your opponent's going to have to consider taking that extra mortal wound in order to get more models. They are definitely a better option for a 9x unit, but how often are you really going to do that? And as you mentioned before, they're easier to strike and fade as a single group, which keeps them alive longer.
Yeah, so, I find the last bullet points of both of these summaries the most important ones. Swords are way swingier, so keep that in mind. Like, you can look at calculations as much as you like, but if it's a swingy unit, you're not going to be able to depend on those calculations as much. And Sylvaneth really thrive on the strike and fade mechanic right now. So being able to put a 500-point unit in your opponent's face, delete something, and then just disapparate is so good compared to leaving an extra sword unit.
Yeah, and so just to reiterate, all the calculations we did before are expected values. Even though it looked complicated by saying it's against no save all the way down to a one-up save, it was still just what we expect to see. It doesn't mean it's going to actually hit that target.
Yeah.
So there's another graph that, now that I'm thinking about it, I wish I'd included at least one of, which is a cumulative distribution from a binomial distribution, which might have been a little bit better at illustrating that swinginess. Perhaps in the Excel video, I'll make one, because I'm going to do a follow-up video to this that shows everyone how my now perfectly functioning Excel file works. And it'll just be a more in the weeds kind of thing for those who want to see not just the results, but want to know how all this is calculated and how you can maybe build it yourself. And while doing that, I'll probably also include that graph to show the swinginess.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. Guys, thank you so much for watching. We are not going to send this one out live as we did with the first one, because we feel it's way too close to the previous live broadcast. So it's just going to be a normal video, but please do leave a like, a comment, possibly even share and subscribe. Especially if you want to follow along with Ryan's Excel sheet in his next video. I'll be doing a video on a Sylvaneth unit next week, a specific guide like I've done for the Lumineth before, so keep an eye out for that as well. Ryan, thank you once again for making all these graphs twice and putting in the huge effort, because I think overall this might have taken you almost 30 hours, you said?
Yeah, it probably, I mean, I wasn't timing it. I wasn't on the clock or anything, but it's taken me about 2 weeks of a few hours at a time putting this thing together. So I hope it's all 100% A-okay now. Thank you again to Siegfried and Atharel for their comments on these math hammer type things relative to this size versus swords argument, and we really love the community. Thanks, guys. We'll keep interacting, and I this is exactly what I was. Even you guys can help me become a better math hammer person myself. So thanks for, even though it was just an Excel issue, I'm really glad we nipped this one in the bud before too many people put their eyes on it. So
yep, there you go, guys. See you in the next one. Have a great weekend. Cheers.